Number 10. The Great Molasses Flood. Imagine a world-ending tidal wave, not of water, but of pure, sticky, delicious molasses. On January 15, 1919, in Boston's North End, a massive storage tank holding over 2 million gallons of molasses burst. The tank was located on the waterfront, and its explosion unleashed a 25-foot-tall wave of sugary syrup that rushed through the streets at an estimated 35 miles per hour. This wasn't some slow, syrupy mess you might imagine spilling on a kitchen floor. This was a liquid battering ram. The wave was so powerful it ripped buildings from their foundations, crushed horse-drawn carriages, and even derailed a streetcar. The aftermath was pure chaos. People were swept up and drowned in the thick, suffocating tide. Rescuers, including police and firefighters, waded through the knee-deep molasses, trying to pull victims from the wreckage. The city was basically one giant, sticky crime scene. It took weeks to clean up, and the smell of molasses, which had permeated every crack and crevice, lingered for years. They even say that on hot summer days, you could still catch a whiff of that sugary disaster. This wasn't just a bizarre historical footnote, it was a genuine tragedy. To this day, it stands as a weird, sticky reminder that even the most mundane things can turn deadly in a flash. Who knew a massive container of breakfast topping could be so dangerous? Number 9. The Dancing Plague. Picture this. It's the year 1518 in the city of Strasbourg, France. A woman named Frau Trophea walks out into the street and starts dancing. No music, no party, just dancing. She doesn't stop. For a whole week, she dances relentlessly. Then other people start joining her. Within a month, hundreds of people are in the streets dancing uncontrollably. They're not happy about it either. They're flailing, twitching, and collapsing from exhaustion, but they can't stop. The city's authorities, instead of thinking, hey, maybe this is a medical problem, decided the best course of action was to build a stage and encourage them to keep dancing. Their logic? If the dancers just danced it out, they would get tired and stop. This, as you might guess, had the opposite effect. More people showed up to watch and got caught up in the mass hysteria, leading to even more dancers. People were literally dancing themselves to death from heart attacks, strokes, and pure physical exhaustion. The whole thing sounds like a bad movie plot, but it was horrifyingly real. Modern historians and doctors think it was likely a case of mass psychogenic illness, triggered by stress, fear, and a belief in supernatural curses. Basically, their collective anxiety was so intense that their nervous systems staged a citywide flash mob, and nobody was allowed to leave. Number 8. The Emu War. You know how sometimes a country has a problem and decides to send in the military? Well, in 1932, Western Australia had a problem. That problem was emus. Thousands of them. A massive migration of emus, numbering in the tens of thousands, was destroying crops and creating general havoc for local farmers. The farmers, desperate, appealed to the government. So the Australian government, with all the logic of a toddler trying to fix a leaky faucet with a hammer, decided to deploy the army. Seriously. They armed soldiers with machine guns and sent them to battle the large, flightless birds. This wasn't a joke. They declared war on the emus. The soldiers, with their military discipline and state-of-the-art weaponry, were quickly humbled. Emus, it turns out, are surprisingly resilient, fast, and most importantly, numerous. They scattered, dodged bullets, and were nearly impossible to hit. The soldiers fired thousands of rounds, killing only a handful of birds, while the emus continued their crop-destroying rampage. After a few weeks of this embarrassing debacle, the military withdrew, defeated by an army of feathered poultry. The local media had a field day, with one newspaper famously writing, "The emus have won." The war was a complete failure, proving that sometimes, even with superior firepower, you just can't win against nature's weirdest, most stubborn birds. Number 7. The Potion of Immortality. If you think people today are gullible, let me introduce you to the French alchemist Nicolas Flamel. Or rather, the myth of him. Flamel was a real person in 14th century Paris, a humble bookseller who became a successful scribe and manuscript dealer. But centuries after his death, a completely fake story popped up that turned him into a sorcerer. The myth claimed that Flamel had discovered the mythical philosopher's stone, the legendary substance that could turn lead into gold and, more importantly, grant eternal life. A book was published under his name, full of bizarre alchemical recipes and cryptic illustrations. Of course, the book was a complete fabrication, written by an anonymous author who needed a credible-sounding name to sell copies. The myth became so pervasive that people genuinely believed Flamel and his wife were still alive, wandering the earth as immortal beings. There were even sightings of him and his wife at various points in history, always looking suspiciously youthful and well-preserved. It's the ultimate case of a posthumous glow-up. The legend persisted for so long that even today, pop culture references, most notably in Harry Potter, still portray him as this legendary alchemist. The real Flamel was just a guy who got rich selling books, but the myth turned him into the world's first and longest-running celebrity ghost story. Number 6. The Disappearing Army. In 1915, during World War I, something truly bizarre happened to a British regiment. The 1/4th Battalion of the Norfolk Regiment, over 250 men strong, was fighting in the Gallipoli campaign in Turkey. According to multiple first-hand accounts from soldiers on both sides, the regiment was marching toward a hill when a strange, dense cloud descended and covered them. It wasn't fog or smoke. Observers described it as a slow-moving, peculiar cloud, about 800 feet long. As the soldiers marched into this cloud, they simply vanished. When the cloud lifted, the hill was empty. Not a single man from the regiment was ever seen again. They didn't come back, and their bodies were never found. After the war, the British government declared them missing in action, but the story of the disappearing cloud became a popular urban legend. The accounts were later revealed to have come from a New Zealand unit that claimed to have witnessed the event. However, it was eventually debunked as a wartime fabrication, a sort of bizarre propaganda or rumor that got out of hand. The mystery was finally solved decades later when historical records suggested the battalion was likely captured and executed by Turkish forces. But for years, the legend of the disappearing army, swallowed whole by a mysterious cloud, made for one of history's most unsettling and truly unbelievable stories. Number 5. The Ballooning Bear. Imagine you're a polar bear minding your own business in the Arctic, and suddenly you're the star of a top-secret military experiment. In the 1960s, during the height of the Cold War, the US and Soviet Union were locked in an endless game of one-upmanship, and no idea was too ridiculous. The US military, worried about potential Soviet advances in the Arctic, came up with a wild plan to spy on them. Their idea? Attach reconnaissance equipment to polar bears and set them loose. Seriously. The plan, codenamed Project Bear, involved tranquilizing polar bears, fitting them with tracking devices and cameras, and then letting them roam free near Soviet territory. The hope was that the bears, being natural inhabitants of the region, would wander close enough to get intelligence without raising suspicion. The military actually went through with it. They captured several polar bears, fitted them with their high-tech spy gear, and released them. The results, as you can probably guess, were not great. The bears, upon waking up, were understandably confused and not at all interested in becoming furry spies. They either immediately ripped the equipment off, or the devices malfunctioned in the harsh Arctic conditions. The project was an expensive, embarrassing failure that proved once and for all that you can't train a polar bear to be James Bond. Number 4. The War on Cats. Let's travel back to medieval Europe, a time when a bad harvest or an outbreak of plague could easily be blamed on the nearest witch, or even better, her feline companion. The fear of witchcraft was so intense that cats, especially black cats, were seen as the devil's familiars. This widespread superstition led to a massive, gruesome war on cats. Seriously. In many cities and villages across Europe, people began to systematically hunt and kill cats in an effort to ward off evil. They would torture and burn them alive in public bonfires, believing they were destroying a source of black magic. This went on for centuries. This wasn't some isolated incident. It was a common and accepted practice. The irony, of course, is that while they were busy waging war on cats, the Black Death was sweeping across the continent, killing millions. The primary carrier of the plague? Flea-infested rats. And what is the natural predator of rats? You guessed it, cats. By wiping out the cat population, people were essentially giving the plague's main carriers free rein to multiply and spread the disease with devastating efficiency. The war on cats wasn't just a bizarre historical footnote. It was a public health disaster caused by mass hysteria and a complete misunderstanding of the food chain. It's a dark, furry lesson in why you shouldn't let superstition guide your public policy. Number 3. The Great Pig Trial. You think humans are the only ones who can be put on trial? Think again. In 1386, a pig in the French town of Falaise was arrested and put on trial for murder. The charge? The pig had attacked and killed a human baby. In a legal proceeding that sounds straight out of a Monty Python skit, the pig was given a lawyer, a judge, and a jury. The court heard witness testimony, and the pig, as the defendant, was given its day in court. Unsurprisingly, the pig was found guilty and sentenced to death by public hanging. It was dressed in human clothing, paraded through the streets, and executed in the town square. This wasn't a one-off event. Animal trials were surprisingly common in medieval Europe, with pigs, dogs, and even insects facing legal proceedings for crimes ranging from murder to property damage. The courts would take these trials incredibly seriously, believing that animals, as God's creatures, were subject to human laws. The whole thing sounds completely insane to modern ears, but it reflects a worldview where the lines between human, animal, and divine law were much blurrier. It's a hilarious yet morbid example of what happens when your legal system takes the concept of equal justice for all a little too literally. Number 2. The Exploding Train. In 1878, a train in London was carrying a shipment of highly explosive fireworks. The train was traveling through a tunnel, and for some reason, the fireworks detonated. The resulting explosion was catastrophic. It tore through the train, killing the conductor and causing the entire tunnel to collapse. But here's where it gets weird. The explosion also vaporized the tunnel walls, leaving behind a perfectly smooth, glass-like surface. It was as if a laser had cauterized the rock. The explosion was so intense that it created a vacuum, sucking the air out of the surrounding area and causing a nearby church's bell tower to collapse. Scientists and engineers who investigated the site were completely baffled. They couldn't explain how the explosion had created such a bizarre and devastating effect. The incident became a source of urban legend, with some people claiming it was a supernatural event or a secret military experiment gone wrong. The truth, as it turned out, was much simpler and somehow even stranger. The train was not carrying fireworks. It was carrying a shipment of nitroglycerin, disguised as a harmless shipment. The explosion was so powerful and so contained within the tunnel that it created a sonic boom that tore the walls apart and created the strange, glassy effect. The entire incident was a bizarre, tragic accident that was completely covered up by the authorities at the time. It's a perfect example of how a cover-up can create a much more interesting and terrifying urban legend. Number 1. The Great Emu War. Again, you thought the first Emu War was the end of it? Oh, you sweet summer child. The emus, apparently emboldened by their decisive victory in 1932, continued to be a problem. The Australian government, having learned absolutely nothing, decided to try again. But this time, they were going to do it right. After the initial disaster, a second, less publicized campaign was launched to deal with the resilient birds. This time, instead of just sending in a handful of soldiers with machine guns, they decided to be more tactical. They started offering bounties on emu heads and deploying trained hunters. But the emus, once again, proved to be a formidable foe. They were a lot smarter than the government gave them credit for, learning to avoid the hunters and adapt to the new tactics. They would scatter and run in different directions, confusing the hunters and making it almost impossible to get a clear shot at a single bird. The emus also learned to recognize the sound of an approaching truck and would flee before the hunters even got close. It was a bizarre, long-running game of cat and mouse where the mice were large, feathered, and seemingly unkillable. The second war, much like the first, was a colossal failure. The emus, with their superior numbers and cunning, once again emerged victorious, cementing their status as the undefeated champions of Australian military history. The whole thing is a hilarious, humbling reminder that sometimes the most bizarre historical events are the ones that repeat themselves.